The Syrian Civil War is back, and it's changed the country forever. And the dictator who plunged Syria into chaos with his brutal regime, he's gone. Overthrown. Bashar al-Assad, who held power for over 2 decades, has fled to Russia, leaving a shattered nation behind. But what does this mean for Syria? Can the country finally move forward after years of bloodshed, or will this new chapter bring more uncertainty and conflict? In this video, we're diving into what reignited the war, how Assad was toppled, and what the future might hold for a country torn apart by violence. Let's start with the reasons behind the reignition. In 2000, Bashar al-Assad succeeded his father Hafez to become president of Syria. The country was already dealing with rampant problems before Assad came to power. Corruption ran rife, no doubt aided by the dictatorial regime the Assad family had in place, and unemployment was at an all-time high of 9.59%. It would only get worse. Unemployment jumped to 11.63% a year after Assad took power, and though it's peaked and troughed in the years since, it's spent the 2020s hovering around the 13 to 15% mark. Life in Syria has only gotten worse for many people under Assad. These terrible conditions, combined with dissatisfaction among the Syrian people for their lack of political freedom, led to several pro-democracy demonstrations taking place in the country. Daraa was the focal point for these protests. Unwilling to give any hint that he would allow Syrians the right to vote, potentially dislodging him from power in the process, Assad responded to these protests with violence. Deadly force was permitted against the dissenters, which only led to more protests demanding that Syria's president resign. Assad decried the opposition supporters as being foreign-backed terrorists, and it wasn't long before his attempts to crush the protests erupted into countrywide violence. The BBC says that hundreds of rebel groups quickly formed, plunging Syria into chaos as fighting spread. That chaos allowed several extremist organizations, notably al-Qaeda and the Islamic State or ISIS, to move into the country. That only led to more chaos. The Syrian Civil War evolved to the point where it was no longer a fight about whether Assad should remain in power. It was a conflict that threatened to tear the country apart as faction upon faction battled each other. Other nations have also gotten involved. Russia has been one of the most prominent forces in Syria. An ally of Assad, Russia launched air campaigns in 2015 to protect its military bases in Syria and turn the tide of the war in the president's favor. Assad has also been supported by Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen, with Lebanon's Hezbollah fighters also joining his cause. In the cases of Afghanistan, Yemen, and Lebanon, the support comes not from the country's governments themselves, but from fighters recruited from these nations. On the western side of the coin, nations like the US, France, and the UK provided arms to what they collectively considered moderate rebel groups. That aid didn't necessarily stop, at least from the US side. As Assad started to assert his dominance, US troops relocated to eastern Syria in 2019, taking up positions in Deir ez-Zor and al-Hasaka to protect oil and gas infrastructure from both IS and the Syrian government. Still, it pulled back a little from its initial support of the moderate rebel groups. Turkey and Saudi Arabia have been far more active. The former has played a role in Syria's civil war from the start, with the BBC noting that its main concern seems to be containing the growing Kurdish rebel factions that have formed in the country. As for Saudi Arabia, it views Syria as a dangerous ally of Iran, and has spent over a decade refusing to engage with Assad in any capacity because of this. Saudi Arabia later softened this stance, claiming that it was time to welcome Syria's return to the Arab fold. That sort of language is what led many to believe that the Syrian civil war was on the verge of ending. At the very least, the conflict had simmered down to the point where fighting was nowhere near as violent as it had been during the 2010s. It would be inaccurate to call Assad's campaign against the many rebel factions in the country a complete success. Syria's president controlled most of the country's major cities, according to the BBC. But there were still several parts of the country that rebels and the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF, still held. Nestled in Syria's northwest, alongside the Aleppo provinces and parts of Hama, Idlib was the last opposition real stronghold Assad had to destroy to retake his country. But as we soon found out, his delaying an assault on that stronghold proved to be his downfall. HTS would become the driving force in the fall of Syria's president. But more on that in a moment. As we know now, Syria's civil war reignited to the point where Assad has been overthrown. This didn't come out of nowhere. There was evidence that Syria was teetering on the edge of the war blowing up all over again before HTS made its fateful moves. We start with the neighboring provinces of Suwaida and Daraa. Led by the region's Druze community, the people of Suwaida have spent over a year continuously protesting against Assad's regime. August 2024 marked a full year of ongoing protests in the region, with the Washington Institute claiming the protests poked holes in Assad's narrative that he's the only person who can protect minorities in the country. The Druze are such minorities. They make make up 90% of Suwaida's population. They only account for 3% of the total Syrian population. Assad had taken a lighter touch with these protesters so far than he did in 2011. That doesn't quite translate as you might imagine. Assassinations, intimidation, kidnapping, and setting up military checkpoints were all part of his tactics, though he had stopped short of a full-blown crackdown that would plunge Suwaida into war. Still, the Syrian president's attempts to cow the protesters into submission have failed. The YouTube channel Warfronts reports that the second half of 2024 has seen the rise of insurgency in Suwaida and Daraa, with criminal activity becoming commonplace. This is not the result of the actions of a single instigating group, Warfront claims, but rather the natural outcome of several factions taking advantage of Suwaida's protests to mount more direct opposition. Among them is the reconciled combatant groups, which had previously agreed to peace with Assad, but had started to launch attacks against Syria's government all over again. These groups were growing. They were pulling in members who were unhappy with Syria's way of life. Remember that unemployment is even higher now than it was when the Syrian Civil War started, and have even perhaps been displaced by Assad's campaigns. Groups like these were turning Assad's tactics against him. The kidnapping of Syrian government and military officials also became more common. Warfront says that these growing rebel groups have captured dozens of Syrian military officers since June 2024, using them to negotiate for the release of civilians and other rebels who would join their collective cause. Therein lay a problem for Assad. The rebel factions in Suwaida and elsewhere have realized that Assad was loath to lose any of his military officers. He was willing to trade, giving the rebel groups a chance to strengthen themselves through the receipt of fighters they'd otherwise lost to Assad's imprisonment. The kidnappings rebel forces were using to gain leverage over Syria's leader were far from the only tactics in play. Warfronts also reports that several factions throughout Syria launched rescue campaigns for their kidnapped and imprisoned allies, while taking an any means necessary approach. Syrian military checkpoints, like the ones Assad was using to try and keep the peace in Suwaida, were also coming under attack once again. Checkpoint attacks were a common strategy during the height of the Syrian Civil War. In November 2012, for instance, Al Jazeera reported that attacks on a trio of checkpoints on the main road leading into Damascus claimed the lives of 28 government soldiers. A similar attack in 2013 saw rebels take out a checkpoint west of Homs, killing 11 people. Assad wasn't above checkpoint attacks either. 2016 saw his forces target an opposition checkpoint operated by the Free Syrian Army, resulting in 20 people dying. The point we're making here is that targeting checkpoints on both sides of the conflict was a common strategy when the Syrian Civil War was at its height, and according to Warfronts, it had started happening all over again. Armed groups launched multiple attacks on military checkpoints, government buildings, and other targets in September 2024. Those attacks didn't appear to be part of a concerted military strategy. Instead, they were often responses to actions taken by Assad's regime. For example, one such attack came when a woman from the Daraa province was arrested as she attempted to renew her passport. Local opposition fighters took up arms in response, attacking a trio of checkpoints and a military intelligence base, along with destroying an armored personnel carrier. Assad's regime capitulated and released the woman. Warfronts also reports that a checkpoint set up by the Assad regime in Suwaida had been targeted by several armed factions. It took just 2 days for that checkpoint to crumble. It fell before Assad could send full reinforcements from Damascus. Those soldiers eventually arrived, only it was too late for it to matter, and the checkpoint simply became one of the many empty guard posts. But so what? You might be thinking. Yes, a hot zone for conflict may have been developing, but it's a small portion of the country. Suwaida measures around 2,140 square miles on the map, and Assad hadn't unleashed his full strength on the region yet. A crackdown would surely allow him to reassert his control while destroying the protests against him. Perhaps. But Assad didn't institute a crackdown. He sat back and did very little to quell the seeds of rebellion in Suwaida. Instead, he allowed rebels in that region to gain leverage over him, perhaps fearing that a full crackdown in Suwaida would lead to more rebel groups uniting to fight against him. And as all of this was going on, he seemed to be completely ignoring the moves HTS was making in Idlib, and those moves were plentiful. HTS is led by former al-Qaeda-connected mainstay Mohammed al-Jalani, though the rebel group's leader has long renounced any ties he had to the terrorist group. For the past several years, he's poured all of his efforts into building HTS into a fighting force capable of toppling Assad's regime. As recently as 5 years ago, HTS was just one of many jihadist groups trying to survive Assad's brutal regime, though it had something important going for it: a stronghold in the Idlib province. It was there that al-Jalani revamped the entire organization. He founded a military academy through which HTS trains leaders capable of commanding fighters on the battlefield. HTS set up a formalized central command structure and developed the ability to rapidly deploy specialized units, including tanks, artillery, and drones, during its evolution from a jihadist group to a fully fledged fighting force. Under al-Jilani, HTS even developed its own rudimentary weapons manufacturing industry. Drones and missiles were all being built in Idlib long before HTS chose its moment to strike. And none of this was particularly under the radar. HTS regularly posted footage to social media of its kamikaze drones in action, including one attack on a Syrian army building that targeted some of Assad's commanders. Even its military academy made the headlines. The Syrian Observer reported on the graduations of the first 400 of the academy's officers back in September 2022. Our point here is that HTS would not have been an unknown quantity to Assad. He knew they existed from his time fighting against them in the earlier phases of the Syrian Civil War, and he must have known that they were strengthening their position in Idlib as the group prepared for a concerted attack on his forces. Still, Assad clearly thought he was safe. HTS spent years locked in Idlib, behind what the BBC describes as frozen front lines. That all changed on November 27th. HTS chose that date to launch a lightning-fast offensive on the Aleppo region. The rebel group quickly seized a military base along with 15 villages previously held by Assad-backed forces. Then they consolidated their position, cutting off the highway linking Aleppo to Damascus. HTS slowed the arrival of Assad's reinforcements, giving themselves the opportunity to take more of Aleppo with minimal resistance. By November 28th, HTS had advanced from Idlib and the surrounding countryside to the point where they were positioned just outside Aleppo. 2 days later, they had complete control of that city. The Syrian military stationed in Aleppo withdrew, supposedly to arrange a counteroffensive, and more forces were rushing in with equipment from the Hama province to fight against the HTS rebels. But it was all for naught. As those reinforcements pushed towards Aleppo, HTS was preparing to move south toward Damascus. Russia also got involved during this early stage of the fighting. The country's President Vladimir Putin has long been a supporter of Assad, even intervening on his behalf during the first phase of the Syrian Civil War, in return for Assad allowing Russia to set up several military bases in Syria. The country was Putin's foothold in the Middle East, giving him a base from which he could influence the politics of the region. Yet Russia's response to the HTS assault was tepid at best. It arranged for a series of airstrikes, most appearing to target medical facilities in Aleppo. One such strike killed 12 people in an Aleppo hospital, with a similar attack in Idlib killing 8 civilians and wounding 50 more. But beyond these limited strikes, Russia didn't do a whole lot to help Assad. Likely limited by its own nearly 3-year engagement in Ukraine, Russia eventually left Syria's forces to fend for themselves against HTS troops that were clearly more organized and tactically astute. That Russian withdrawal sounded the death knell for Assad's regime. After taking Aleppo, HTS switched its focus to moving further south. By December 5th, the group had taken control of Hama. You may remember this city as the one from which Assad attempted to send reinforcements into Aleppo, showing just how useless those extra troops proved to be in the face of the HTS advance. HTS maintained its rapid pace in the face of crumbling Syrian military resistance. It took the country's second city of Homs over the December 7th weekend, using that city as a base to push into Syria's capital of Damascus. By Monday, HTS practically controlled that city, which might lead you to think that it would give it a chance to arrest Assad and force him to face some sort of punishment for his crimes. Assad took that chance away from HTS. Syria's despotic president fled, and he landed into the welcoming arms of the man who'd propped him up since 2015, Vladimir Putin. On December 8th, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a statement confirming that Assad has relinquished his role as Syria's president. Following his talks with a number of participants in the armed conflict in the Syrian Arab Republic, Bashar al-Assad decided to step down as the Syrian president and leave the country, instructing the government to transfer power peacefully, read the statement. The ironic call for peace ignores the brutality that reigned during Assad's regime. Alexei Muraviev of Curtin University in Australia says welcoming Assad into Moscow is intended to show leaders in Russia's other client states that Putin will protect, with a proviso. This is a signal to other Russian clients and friends in the region, in the Gulf region, in the broader Middle East, as well as in Africa, in Asia, says Muraviev. As long as you remain loyal, we're not going to abandon you. That may be the case, but the fact remains that Assad is gone. In less than 2 weeks, HTS was able to overrun the dictator's military, taking advantage of Russia's inability to support Assad due to Putin's special military operation in Ukraine in the process, and depose Assad. Syria's former leaders claim that he would crush the rebels when he met Iran's foreign minister during the HTS assault proved false. He didn't crush anything, he ran, leaving his troops and his supporters at the mercy of HTS. It appears that the second phase of the Syrian Civil War is over almost as quickly as it began. That brings us to an obvious question: what next for Syria? The first step for HTS seems to be to destroy as many symbols of the Assad family's reign as possible. The Washington Post says that HTS has formed a coalition with several other rebel groups and is in the process of consolidating control throughout Syria's east. Along the way, they've destroyed the tomb of Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's father and the dictator who led Syria from 1971 until his death in 2000. The tomb is now a smoldering wreck, having been lit on fire by the rebels. HTS and its allies also claimed to have taken Deir al-Zor, which is the largest city in Syria's east, on November 11th. Those claims are unverified, says the Washington Post, but it seems unlikely HTS would be lying, given that it now controls Damascus and has found so much success elsewhere. As for the political side of Assad's downfall, HTS appears to be trying to maintain some form of stability as it advances through Syria. Mohammed al-Bashir was installed as Syria's prime minister on December 10th, with his role seeming to be to guide the country through what is sure to be a difficult transitional period. After all, it's not just HTS that conducted the assault against Assad's forces. It led the assault, but the group also cooperated with other rebels to topple the Syrian dictator's regime. Al-Bashir's installation will provide some stability as those coalition forces move through Syria to bring the rest of the country under their control. In terms of global geopolitics, Assad's downfall can be seen as nothing but a major strategic defeat for both Russia and Iran, Brookings argues. It's also a major hit against the other Gulf Arab monarchies that were willing to support Assad's regime. All stand to lose political influence, with Russia in particular at risk of losing the many military bases and installations it has in Syria. Moscow claims that it's negotiating with HTS to keep those bases, but how likely is it that the rebel forces will want to allow the country that supported Assad to remain in Syria now the dictator has fallen? Turkey, having long supported rebel factions in Syria, stands to be one of the big winners. It's likely that HTS will provide the country with favorable treatment, much to the dismay of Putin and his cronies in the Kremlin. And we can't forget about the United States. With President-elect Donald Trump coming into office in January 2025, much of the responsibility for engaging with the new Syrian leadership will rest on his shoulders. Outgoing President Joe Biden is already laying some groundwork, with the Brookings Institution reporting that he's reconsidering HTS's designation as a terrorist organization. But it will be up to Trump to build a new relationship with Syria when he comes to power. HTS may hope that it can work alongside the US to create a blueprint for setting up its new leadership in the country it's taken back. Still, the future is uncertain in Syria. Right now, HTS are liberators rescuing the country's people from a despotic regime. The question now is, how effective will those liberators be in rebuilding the country after winning the second phase of the Syrian Civil War? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video.